The fighting is over for now. They are left with a golden bar. But what after? Well, let's find out. All that remained on the rooftop was a burnt golden bar in the coffin. Faust observed that it was burnt white, and that someone made off with the other. Dante told her that Nellie took the intact golden bar, understanding Herman's part in this. Heathcliff didn't see this as a failure. They'll get it back, even if their hearts were broken apart. If he gives it his all, they'll be connected once again, as he did even in that world where he and Catherine both died peacefully. Sinclair asked if that was the name of the person in that coffin, apologizing as everything felt so foggy. Faust didn't care, as the coffin and the person inside it would be retrieved by the after team. Dante wanted to ask if Heathcliff was okay, but it was clear that he wasn't. So many things had gone wrong. Heathcliff answered as expected by Dante. Heathcliff's only goal was gone, but he was no longer trapped by the past, which was why he could open the door to a new, wider world once the tempest that was around him passed. Yet not a single colour remained, all save for patches of violet. Heathcliff then told them that the flowers were called heath, lonely flowers that took root and bloomed in wild moorlands, but they survived no matter what comes their way, tempest or otherwise. They endure it and wait. Dante asked what they waited for. Heathcliff answered, that time. Now this was interesting. There's some details that I can't really overlook. If the timeline of the universe that they were in was altered to accommodate the erasure of Kathy, then she should never have existed to send that invitation in the first place, and so they would have no reason to go to Wuthering Heights. And Linton would have no reason to acquire the golden bar in the District 20 branch facility. And that deal with NCorp to make that lab in the basement would never have happened, and that lab would never have been built. As for Hindley, he would either be the owner of Wuthering Heights, or he'd lose it anyway, without Nellie ruining his life. Or even him ruining it himself. This is based on the coffin and Catherine's corpse. So, in at least the universe where the erasure was triggered from, while the memory of Catherine was erased, none of her effects were. Which was why they were still on the rooftop of Wuthering Heights and not in the branch facility. Which means that Heathcliff is still the owner of Wuthering Heights on paper, as it's likely that both Linton and Hindley are still dead, along with all but Nellie, who legged it to join NCorp's team, stealing back the golden bar that was stolen by NCorp in District 4. Then Dante and the damned dozen went back to the bus. Heathcliff now having a new goal, to somehow bring Catherine back into existence, likely as some kind of living paradox, while also assisting those that have, still have unfinished business. While two of those in Mephistopheles had much to think about, Gregor with Herman still haunting him, and Virgilius understanding the consequences of his actions in the basement that will be made clear at a later date, all while some heath was hung on the bus. And in the background, Don Quixote was looking through her stuff for the butler action figure, and Dante was holding onto the burnt golden bar, likely asking themselves if it's possible to restore it. Sometime after, they were after a distortion in the back streets of District 20. Gregor pointed it out, Heathcliff asking where the bloody hell Sinclair's looking at. Sinclair would have appreciated it if he told him first. Yes, they were hunting distortions on the way to the next destination. Heathcliff had a spectacular return to form after what happened that day. Heathcliff was angered by Sinclair not sending it his way, threatening to smash his head in once this was over. Dante was silently observing this when Demian appeared. They were surprised by them having colour. Yes, Demian had colour, and he claimed that it was because the light had yet to reach him. A star is an unfathomable distance away, asking if Dante likes flowers as well. Dante had come to like them. Demian then asked if there was a single rose that they cared for a long time. Their room was always brimming from the sweet aroma of that flower, but one day the rose was left behind, and they went to go on a long journey. Then they came across a large garden, and there was thousands of the same rose that they once cared for. The sight brought them to tears, and they dropped to their knees, asking why that was the case, why they were all there. Dante understood that Demian always left them with cryptic riddles in the past, and this time was no different. They're starting to understand what those riddles really meant. It's because they've come to understand that the one they truly loved was the rose they left behind. Demian saw this as correct. There were thousands of roses, but only one that truly mattered. They watered it, cared for it, even pricked its thorns with their fingers, so that the aroma bloomed. Then we found out that Demian remembered Catherine, and her complicated relationship with Heathcliff, even though only Dante and Heathcliff should be able to remember her. Likely because Demian is not human, seeming to be something that is outside of reality as it's known, which would also explain why he still has colour, even though he should be monochrome, along with the rest of the environment. He said that's how it was for Heathcliff and Catherine, knowing that there are many versions of them. They only wished for their own happiness in their world, as that's what truly mattered. Most would take a long time to understand that, as most are foolish, asking if they understand this. Once they learn to properly love their own flower, they no longer need to protect the thousands of other roses. People of this star care for thousands of rose blossoms in their own gardens, but still fail to find what they really desire. When Dante asks what of the other flowers that have already bloomed, Demian told them that they'd find that out for themselves when they drew him as sheep. Then Demian disappeared. Then Dante heard the faint cry of a distant lamb. Now, Demian wasn't just based on Demian by Hermann Hesse. He was also a reference to The Little Prince by Anton de Saint-Exupéry. Sorry. You can see I still struggle with English, never mind any other language. Yes. There are themes of a number of things on that French children's story. Loneliness being one of them. This chapter is clearly based around Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, where it starts with an unusual family, at least according to a tenant of Heathcliff, who then had the story of that family explained by Nellie, his housekeeper, where Mr. Earnshaw brought in Heathcliff as a child who was treated as a favourite, while neglecting the other two children, especially after his wife died. While Hindley beat Heathcliff up, Catherine grew close to him. And after Mr. Earnshaw died, Hindley returned after he went to university and brought back his wife Frances, where he was the master of Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff was allowed to stay there as a servant. Catherine and Heathcliff spied on Edgar and Isabella Linton, who lived nearby. Catherine was attacked by a dog and was taken in by them, and Heathcliff was sent home. When the Lintons visited, they made fun of Heathcliff, provoking a fight, resulting in him being locked in the attic. And this was the start of Heathcliff's vengeful mentality. 2 years later, Hindley and Frances have a son called Harleton. Catherine was engaged to Edgar, as while she loved Heathcliff and wanted to help him, his low social status would degrade her. And just as Nellie warned, it backfired, as Heathcliff heard that part of the conversation, and so he left Wuthering Heights. Catherine did not take this well. 3 years later, Edgar and Catherine got married. Heathcliff returned wealthy and refined. Isabella was drawn to him, but he saw her as a means to an end. His return and his presence there enraged Edgar, and he cut off contact, which made Catherine lock herself in her room. She couldn't eat, and this wasn't a good thing as she was pregnant with Edgar's child. Heathcliff won Wuthering Heights from Hindley when the latter gambled this away. Heathcliff eloped with Isabella, but this didn't end well. Certainly not for her. Heathcliff snuck into Catherine's room, but she died not long after. And before that, she gave birth to Cathy, her daughter with Edgar. He cried out in rage after that, calling on her ghost to haunt him as long as he lived. While this was happening, Isabella gave birth to Linton, her son with Heathcliff and Hindley. And she died 6 months later, meaning that Wuthering Heights was Heathcliff's. But at what price? 12 years had passed. Linton was made to live with Heathcliff, while he was originally intending to be with his uncle Edgar. Heathcliff wanting Linton and Cathy to marry, so that he could lay claim to Edgar's estate. They moved in with him, and as soon as Edgar died, it became, well, that estate became his, and he grew increasingly unstable. Over time, digging up her grave, plagued by her ghost. In the end, Harleton and Cathy were planning to marry, and the ghosts of Catherine, Heathcliff, and Edgar were finally at peace. Now with Heathcliff, in the source material, many elements match up to the game. Heathcliff being brought to Wuthering Heights by Mr. Earnshaw, his poor treatment by Hindley, including beating him, the dog attack on Catherine as they were spying on their neighbours, him overhearing a conversation where Catherine saw it as degrading if they were to be married, although in the novel she also mentioned his low status. He returned when he made his fortune. At that point, he became vindictive and cruel, wanting to destroy those that tormented him, and those that stopped him from being with Catherine, swindling Hindley out of Wuthering Heights, exploiting his vices, seeing Isabella as a means to an end, even marrying the son he had with Isabella, with Catherine's daughter with Edgar, whom he cared for after her mother's death. Yet, they broke the cycle of hatred. Despite his best efforts to mold Harleton into a copy of himself to prove that anyone can end up like him if they went through what he did, he was slowly destroyed from within in the end. Now, the analysis is more complicated here, as the main Heathcliff would appear to match up to the source material Heathcliff that had returned after his self-imposed exile, the vindictive actions yet to occur, while Elking Heathcliff was what the source material Heathcliff ended up becoming in the end, where vengeance was all that remained. He tormented everyone's children in the source material, but Elking Heathcliff took it much farther, as he did what Jet Li's character in The One did, hunting down every variant of Heathcliff and those that had tormented him. There are even some that believe that, well, there's at least a theory that Heathcliff in the source material is Mr. Earnshaw's illegitimate son. Ooh, let's hope not, as that would result in Sweet Home Alabama between him and Catherine. As for the world where it ended up well for Heathcliff and Catherine, it's hinted that it was Harleton and Cathy that was beside their graves. Of the three named in Catherine's will, Heathcliff was the only one that truly changed and wasn't chained to the past. Well, certainly not compared to the others. Hindley was an alcoholic who commanded less respect than Heathcliff did. I mean, even his hired thugs didn't think much of him. Linton thought Heathcliff to be beneath him, and Catherine, well, in reality, Linton was seen as a backup for Heathcliff, as far as Catherine was concerned, and all he brought with him was his own servants, while Heathcliff was able to make something of himself, and he certainly improved his management of his anger, and was among those that he could trust to fight alongside with, and has work that he's actually good at, a place that he felt that he belonged. Okay, let's talk about Hindley Earnshaw. His alcohol and gambling. Yes. He was an alcoholic and a gambler in the source material, and that was due to the death of his wife, Frances. He beat up Heathcliff and kept him in an uncomfortable state, doing so with another. He treated him as a servant even before he took over as master of Wuthering Heights. In fact, that was the only reason why he allowed Heathcliff to remain there after the death of his father. He gambled away Wuthering Heights to Heathcliff and died sometime after. Yes, that was how it went in the source material. And while in the source material he was ruined by Heathcliff when he swindled him out of Wuthering Heights, and possibly was murdered by him, although that last part was unclear. In the game, he lost Wuthering Heights due to the meddling of a combination of Catherine, Nellie, due to her Backstreets connections, and Earl King Heathcliff, who had more personal reasons for doing so. Now with Isabella Edgar, while in the source material, Isabella was seen as a tool of vengeance by Heathcliff, which ended up destroying her. As for in the game version, she didn't bear a child for Heathcliff, and she was used as a tool by Earl King Heathcliff and Encore, where she was one who was overwritten by an identity, specifically the one who would become Earl King Heathcliff. Then we have Josephine. While in the source material, Joseph survived the events of Wuthering Heights, in the game story, Josephine was killed by Earl King Heathcliff, although in that case it was self-defense as she was trying to kill him. Yes, and in this case, this character is a mix of Joseph from Wuthering Heights and novel Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, where Mrs. Danvers had an obsession with her dead mistress. Now for Linton Edgar, in the source material, the name was Edgar Linton, who had a distaste towards Heathcliff due to his jealousy towards him, and this was strong enough to make him knock Heathcliff down, which provoked physical violence. While in the game story, Linton Edgar was an that looked down on Heathcliff in a more subtle way than Hindley, digging into him metaphorically that Catherine married him instead of Heathcliff, going along with Catherine's plan to ruin Hindley, although there is one constant between the two versions. He'll prioritise Catherine's happiness over his own. Now, Linton Edgar also has elements from the son of Heathcliff and Isabella, Linton, such as his ill health, which was implied to be tuberculosis, which made him less capable of wielding his rapier. Now, as for Catherine, while there are constants between the two versions, such as the dog attacking her, the Catherine in the source material wanted to have her cake and eat it too. She wanted the lifestyle that marrying Edgar would bring while having Heathcliff on the side. Okay, that doesn't sound good when it's put that way. She was also prone to hysterics, which adversely affected her health, while in the game, she was much calmer, and as for her motivations for marrying Linton, it was because she was an aspiring inventor and needed his family's money to make that possible. Marrying Heathcliff would have left her destitute and unable to be an inventor. At least not as well as she would have done. Ooh, it makes this version of her sound like a gold digger, doesn't it? Although, it's more understandable when her motive of using that money to help Heathcliff be a better person was mentioned. Even though she was still depressed after Heathcliff left Wuthering Heights, seemingly never to return. Although she did have her troll moment with Hindley, as in her will, she wanted to send him to the M-Corp, the M-Corp loony bin, with travel arrangements already made, including a warp train ticket. As for the dog attack, in the game, these dogs were giant and had anticoagulant saliva, which made those bitten by them not stop bleeding. While in the source material, she died after giving birth to her daughter Kathy, in the game, she sought to erase herself from the multiverse. which she was largely successful with, although in the universe where it started, as in hers, the memory of her might have been erased by, or rather from, almost everyone, but not her actions. Now with Melly, the constant between the two versions of her is that they both have a hatred towards Heathcliff and Cathy, while the source material version of Nellie kept it to herself to keep her job and potentially avoid the workhouse. She loyally served her masters to the end, regardless of what she thought of them. The game version kept her opinion to herself, largely because of a contract that prevented her from just leaving. Yet the game version was also supportive towards Heathcliff and Catherine, being loyal to the latter and largely kind to the former. At least that's what she wanted to be seen as before Heathcliff returned, she was working with Encore. After looking into the mirror shard and out of fear of being caught in the destruction between Heathcliff and Catherine, like so many variants of herself, she sought to destroy everyone in Wuthering Heights to be free. Yet even when she got what she wanted, after Heathcliff realized that he owned Wuthering Heights and freed her from her service, she still took the golden bar and returned to N-Corp's embrace, essentially replacing one servitude with another, specifically with one that's just as bad, if not worse, considering what N-Corp has been up to since the events of Leviathan. She was freed by Heathcliff only to willingly put the shackles of N-Corp on. A deal with a devil, which in this case is defined as Herman, which is likely to end in subjugation, even if it doesn't begin with it. As to where this applies to in the Divine Comedy, this is clearly applicable to the fifth circle of hell, a place for those that are actively wrathful, where it's described as the swampy, stinking waters of the river Styx. A river was mentioned as where the spirits of the dead lingered that flowed underneath Wuthering Heights. The river Styx being the river that led to the underworld, which was guarded by a three-headed dog called Cerberus. Well, there was 3 canine adversaries. 2 of them appeared in Chapter 6. The first was when Heathcliff and Catherine were children, and the mutant guard dog bit Catherine. That happened in the past. The second was Hindley, after he distorted, and the third was Heathcliff, when he distorted. Also, one of his usable EGO was derived from the alleyway watchdog. It came from an abnormality that's a multi-headed canine beast. They were choked by the rage that consumed them in life. Dante and Virgil were accosted by one that caused Dante to have his property seized after his exile from Florence, or Firenze, as the locals would call it, by his brother. He was seized by other wrathful souls due to him enabling his brother's actions. This could be seen in the Wild Hunt, the wrathful undead seeking to destroy the Heathcliff of that world, and any that would try to protect him. Let's start with Asia regarding the theory part of this. Now, Asia might be outwardly with Encore, but it appears that his true lords might be elsewhere. Although one thing was clear, that Yi-sang objected to his research being corrupted by him into, well, what he saw in that basement. It made Yi-sang outraged and sickened by it. The same research that Virgilius saw 17 months prior that caused him to lose almost everything that mattered. As for Demian, it's clear that he's not human, and also outside of reality. Just not in a crazy way, as he was just unaffected by the colour draining that's a byproduct of T-Corp's singularity. While the origin of the golden bars is unclear, their properties to warp reality are. It explains how Virgilius could see it as possible to restore Charon to Lapis, and also bring back Garnet. It's also why Heathcliff believed that he could restore Catherine's existence. As for Virgilius, while he was seemingly going against the terms of the contract, as the damned dozen weren't dead and Dante could still revive them safely, he showed what he was capable of when he was no longer holding back, demonstrating what his EGO was capable of in an animated form. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was Aleph level, based on what it was capable of. I mean, he could probably give Kali, the Red Mist, a run for her money. As for the Zayn EGO of that band of emotional retards, it's likely that they weren't manifested by the more usual means, such as strong emotions and more or less telling Carmen to go herself, as they didn't seem to have immunity to distortion, as Moses mentioned that those that manifest EGO, or psychomant as it's otherwise known as in the distortion detective, they couldn't distort. Although, in this case, it was possible that their EGO was incomplete, much like it was with Philip of the Dawn Office and Xiao, formerly Grade 1 Director of Lu Association South Section 1. Before each approached their breaking points, one was encouraged to give up, the other to not give up. Perhaps in the future, there could be an ascension where the EGO becomes stronger, perhaps becoming Aleph, or at least higher than Zayn, where it's explained in-universe as fully manifesting EGO. As for the mirror that Herman gave to Nelly, who gave it to Catherine, it's unclear if it was the original mirror that Yi-sang left behind in his cell in Encore, after finding out that he could have walked out of his cell at any time, or one that was made from his research that he left behind, but it turned out that the mirror could communicate with other variants, not just one of them. Whether that was by Yi-sang's design, or it was due to Herman or Asia modifying it. It's unclear, but I suspect that there are reasons why Yi-sang only communicated with Sang Yi. One, because he was the only one that mattered. Two, if he communicated with any other variants, it might make him feel like he's worse than nothing, due to the interactions between so many variants, much like it did with Nelly. And I don't think it was a side effect of the mirror itself, but it's more the psychological existential horror. Yes. Psychological existential horror. Yes, that's a good way of putting it, and sums it up nicely. Dante is certainly getting better as manager, being supportive of the others, to the extent that they can help Heathcliff revert back to human after distorting, although the others had to beat him enough to get him to stop attacking them long enough to get him back to his senses. They even considered other applications of their powers beyond time inversion. Well, Dante did, as that's what they were for. And the reason why Dante didn't do this sooner, was because they didn't consider the possibility, at least until it was truly needed. As for the off-camera distortion hunts, it's clear that they'll continue doing the secondary objective of Limbus Company on the way to their next destination, which, based on the roadmap for this season, well, Chapter 7 will involve the nutty blonde girl Don Quixote being next to have her group therapy session, where we'll be able to sift the facts from the fiction, whether she is how she is due to insanity or something that she consciously made up. But before that, it'll be time killing time, which, based on the preview image, where few are they're wearing a recognizable outfit, it appears that this is themed around Sherlock Holmes. Yes, a series of stories created by Arthur Conan Doyle. While Chapter 6.5, Part 2, Time Killing Time being Chapter 6.5 Part 1, will be called Murder on the Warp Express, and that would appear to be a clear reference to Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. Yes, let's hope that Virgilius can be the Hercule Poirot in that, allowing him to demonstrate his detective skills due to him being a Seven Association affiliate, at least in the past. His office was certainly aligned with them. As far as I'm aware, his contract wouldn't prevent him from using his detective skills. It only restricted him from intervening in combat, except under very specific circumstances. Whatever happened next, N-Corp was likely to follow, either to get in their way, do something that they stumble upon, or find new recruits for N-Corp's group of fighters, likely setting the Damned Dozen up for a collision course with this group, which so far looks like it consists of Gubo, Herman, Jiahuan, Ahab, and now Nelly. Not sure about Azia at this point, and as for Sonia, he was loosely allied with N-Corp for a time. The reasoning behind recruiting such people that has personal connections with the Damned Dozen is either because they could be useful to N-Corp, or it's because if they don't recruit them, a rival faction might, perhaps leading to a fight between the two groups. Much like in Library of Ruina, there was a setup between the library and the Reverberation Ensemble, the final battle being between the Black Stain and the Blue Sicko. As for how this develops, I suspect it will likely be similar, but different. As for songs that apply to this chapter, at the start it was Don't Go Breaking My Heart by Elton John and Kiki D. In the middle of it, both You Give Love a Bad Name by Bon Jovi and Heart Demolition by Dragon Force apply to that. Towards the end, the song that applied to it was I Will Do Anything for Love by Meatloaf. To finish this off, there are Zayn EGO that seem to change depending on the story progress. With Heathcliff's body sack, he said, "You'll get shoved in this bag too," which is based on his direct and blunt way of doing things, including combat. When past Chapter 6-34, he says, "I have to meet Catherine, and everything that stands in my way will," which makes his determination to get to Catherine clear, and he will destroy any that stand in his way. After Chapter 6 is complete, he says, "Even if you are forgotten to this world, I'll get you back." This demonstrates that he still remembers Catherine, despite her being seemingly erased from existence, or at least the memory of her, and his determination to somehow restore her, at least in that reality. Much like how, before dealing with Ahab, Ishmael says, That has to be alive still. When she uses her snag harpoon EGO. After Chapter 5 is complete, she says, "This is how I will charge my own path." Yes, that's the first EGO to do that, and this is based on her determination to set her own path and not follow one blindly that's set by another. As for identities, which I'll go over before Don Quixote's story starts, all identities in EGO, well, certainly the identities, will no longer mention Catherine. Well, except the default identity and body sack EGO. Right, that's Chapter 6 done. Now is the wait until Chapter 6.5. Until next time. Hail the rabbit!